The middle-aged cowboy received an Apache woman as a thank you gift from his son. Before we ride into this tale, don't forget to like the video and tell us where you're watching from. Taren Wolfmark had been living alone for almost 7 long years. The war had taken more than the hearing in one ear. It had taken his wife, Suni Wildrose, and their newborn Tika Snowbud, while he was still wearing Union blue and fighting hundreds of miles away. When he came home, there was nothing left but the cabin they had built together, and a stretch of sunburnt, stubborn land no one wanted but him. Since then, his life had been stripped down to a single purpose: keep the ranch alive, feed the cattle, keep his hands busy so the silence wouldn't crush him. That afternoon, he sat on the porch with his boots resting on the bottom rail, watching dust drift across the yard like ghosts. He wasn't waiting for anyone. He rarely did. But when the faint rhythm of hooves reached his ears, his spine straightened. Out here, sound was warning before sight. A rider appeared over the ridge, fast and reckless, a trail of pale dust chasing him. Taren frowned. That wild way of riding belonged to his son, Jed Thornfield, every time he'd done something foolish. Taren pushed himself up his knees, stiff, and stepped to the edge of the porch. Jed swung down before his horse had even stopped, a rope in hand. Behind him, tied like a pack animal, stood a young Apache woman. For a moment, Taren just stared, his stomach tightening as he took in the sight. Her wrists were bound so tight the skin beneath was raw and red, bare feet in the dirt, her long dark hair tangled with sweat and dust. The torn deerskin on her shoulder revealed the curve of her collarbone, signs of struggle and humiliation. "What the hell is this supposed to be?" Taren asked, his voice low and edged. Jed grinned, the careless grin of a boy who thought himself clever. "A gift. A thank you. Folks caught her stealing corn by the post and said someone ought to make use of her. You've been breaking your back out here, Pa. Figured you deserved something for yourself." Taren's jaw flexed, the muscle tightening under his beard. He wasn't a man who spoke quick, but the sight of that rope around her wrists made something heavy settle in his chest. "She's not a horse, Jed. You'd rather I left her to hang Jed shot back. They'd have whipped her raw in town. I saved her life." Taren's eyes shifted to the girl. She stood rigid, chin lifted, breathing through her nose, eyes locked on him. They weren't begging, they were defiant, sharp, daring him to see her as human. Beneath that fire, he saw something else, fear, and the emptiness of someone who expected no mercy. "Cut her loose," Taren said finally. Jed blinked. "What I said, cut her loose." His tone was sharp, final. Jed hesitated, then sighed and drew his knife, slicing through the rope. The woman rubbed her wrists, but she didn't run. Taren took a slow breath. He didn't want trouble with the town, didn't want another soul to care for, but sending her back humiliated and tied would have been worse. "She can stay," Taren said. "Stay." Jed frowned. "She'll work for her keep. You don't have to come back here if you don't like it." Jed scoffed, but said nothing. He mounted up again and rode off, the sound of hooves fading down the trail until only wind and silence remained. Taren turned to the girl. "Come on," he said, motioning toward the house. She hesitated, but followed him to the porch. Inside the cabin smelled of smoke, leather oil, and solitude. Taren placed a plate of beans and bread on the table, then stepped back. She stood for a long moment before crouching down to eat, quick and cautious. He watched her hands, small, trembling slightly, and felt a strange ache stir in his chest. When she finished, he pointed toward the corner near the hearth. "You can sleep there." He set a folded blanket on the floor and went to bank the fire for the night. Sitting at the edge of his bed, he could feel her eyes on him, sharp, wary, untrusting. He didn't speak again as the flames died to embers. The cabin sank into silence, the only sound the whisper of wind through the cracks. Lying back, staring at the rafters, Taren wondered if he'd made life harder for both of them. But he knew this much: he couldn't have turned her away. Across the room, the girl shifted under the blanket, her body tense, her eyes still open. She didn't close them for a long while. Neither did he. The silence between them was heavy, but for the first time in years, Taren Wolfmark didn't mind sharing it. Before dawn, he woke as he always did, the fire, faintly glowing breath misting in the cold air. He sat up, boots scraping the floor, and looked toward the hearth. She was still there, wrapped in the blanket, eyes open. She hadn't slept, he could tell. Her posture was tight, ready to run if he moved too fast. "Morning," Taren said quietly. She didn't answer. Just pulled the blanket closer, her gaze locked on him like a wild creature unsure whether to flee or stay. "Morning," Taren Wolfmark muttered, his voice still rough from sleep. Asha Moonleaf didn't answer. She just sat up straighter, clutching the edge of the blanket as if it were armor. "You hungry?" he asked after a moment. A pause, then a small nod. Without another word, Taren moved to the stove. He scraped the ashes, set the old coffee pot over the coals, and dropped 2 eggs into a dented skillet. The smell of hot iron and frying bread filled the small cabin. When the plate was ready, he placed it on the table and stepped back, letting her decide if she'd come closer. After a long hesitation, she did cautiously, like a stray, unsure of its welcome. She sat at the edge of the chair, eating slowly, eyes darting toward him every few seconds, as if expecting a trap. Taren stayed on his feet, drinking his coffee from a tin cup, watching just enough to make sure she ate for real. When the last bite was gone, he set his cup down and leaned on the table. "You can stay," he said evenly, "but you'll work. This ain't charity." Her dark eyes narrowed a little, then she gave a small, steady nod. "You got a name?" he asked. After a pause, she said quietly, "Asha." "All right, Asha." He pulled on his coat from the peg. "Come on." Outside, the cold bit at their breath. Dawn light stretched thin and gray across the yard, glinting off frost that clung to the fence rails. Taren led her to the well, showing her the bucket and rope. "Water first. Then we'll check the herd." She stood still, weighing whether to follow his order. He didn't press, didn't raise his voice. Finally, she stepped forward, small hands gripping the rope. The bucket creaked as she hauled it up steady, not spilling a drop. Taren felt something shift in him, respect. She wasn't helpless. By mid-morning, they were out in the pasture. Taren moved slow, careful not to spook her, showing how to scatter feed and check the troughs. She worked quiet and quick, keeping her distance. When they headed back, he noticed the torn edge of her dress brushing against her dusty legs. "I'll find you better clothes," he said. Asha glanced at him, surprise flickering in her eyes before she looked away. Inside, he dug through a cedar chest at the foot of his bed and pulled out an old shirt and skirt that had once belonged to Suni Wildros. He handed them over without a word. Her fingers brushed his just for a heartbeat before she turned to change near the hearth. Taren stepped outside, giving her space. When he came back in, she wore the shirt sleeves rolled up the skirt nearly to her ankles. She looked different now. Not like a captive, but like someone who belonged in a home. She didn't meet his eyes, but she didn't retreat either. The rest of the day moved steady. He fixed a loose rail at the corral while she swept the cabin clean and scrubbed the table. They didn't talk, but there was rhythm between them now. One worked, while the other worked, no one standing idle. That night after supper, Taren pulled off his boots at the edge of the bed. Asha spread her blanket near the hearth again, but this time she lay on her side facing the fire, one hand stretched toward its warmth. He watched her for a moment before lying back. The silence felt different now. Not sharp, not lonely, softer. Snow came before dawn, falling thick and quiet. By morning the ranch was blanketed white, the ground squeaking under boots. When Taren woke, the cabin was still and warm. Asha slept curled by the fire at last. He poured coffee quietly and stepped outside, half expecting to see footprints leading away from the porch. There were none. When he came back, she was awake, hair falling forward over her face, eyes flicking toward the door, as if wondering why he hadn't locked it. He just nodded toward the table. Eat. Then we'll check the cattle. And that became their morning. Coffee. Few words. Then work. Taren showed her how to pitch hay, how to spread salt, how to tell when a calf was ailing. She didn't speak, just watched, learning fast. Once, as she bent to fill the trough, the seam of the skirt split a little more. Taren caught himself looking, then turned away. That evening, he set a needle and thread on the table. Mend it, he said simply. She did, sitting near the firelight, her fingers working neat and quick. Her hair kept slipping forward, and she pushed it back behind her ear. The soft rhythm of her stitching filled the cabin. When the wind began to rattle the shutters, Asha startled. Taren crossed the room and checked the latch. "Storm's passing," he said quietly. She exhaled, relaxing just a little, and he noticed. By the third morning, Taren Wolfmark finally trusted Asha Moonleaf enough to leave her alone at the cabin while he rode the fence line. When he returned near dusk, the faint curl of smoke drifted from the chimney, and the smell of beans simmering over the fire greeted him before he even stepped through the door. She had cooked without being told. "Good," he said simply, hanging his hat on the peg. She didn't smile, but something softened in her expression. That night the fire burned hotter, and they sat closer, not from fear, but because it felt right. Taren worked at the table, carving a new handle for his axe, while Asha mended a piece of harness leather by lamplight. Their silence was no longer tense. It had settled into something steady, two people sharing the same small world, without crowding each other. Before turning in, Taren laid another quilt by her blanket near the hearth. "Gets colder at night," he said quietly. Asha nodded once, met his eyes briefly, then lay down. When Taren stretched out on his bed, a slow breath left him. She hadn't run, hadn't fought, hadn't made his life harder. She was learning, working, cleaning, fitting into the rhythm of the place. Deep inside, something long buried stirred the sense that this home, empty for so long, might be waking again. The cold deepened as the days passed. Frost bit at their lungs each morning. More than once, Taren woke to ice crusting the inside of the window panes. He and Asha worked double-breaking ice in the troughs, hauling water before it froze solid. The daylight was short, the nights endless, forcing them inside earlier each evening. One afternoon, while Taren was fixing a hinge by the barn, he heard the metallic clatter of a bucket and the soft gasp that followed. He turned just in time to see Asha slip on the frozen ground near the well. He crossed the yard in 3 quick strides, catching her arm before she hit the ground. She froze under his grasp, breath sharp and visible in the cold air. For a heartbeat, they just stood there close enough for him to see how her damp hair stuck to her cheek, how her chest rose and fell fast against the cold. Taren eased his hold, making sure she was steady before stepping back. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded, eyes wide, and bent to grab the bucket again. Taren took it from her, hauled it up himself, and set it aside. "Careful there," he said softer than usual. "You'll break your neck if you don't watch your step." Her gaze lingered on him a moment too long before she turned toward the cabin. That evening the air inside felt different, quiet, but not uneasy. Asha sat closer to the fire, her knees drawn up beneath her skirt. Taren sharpened his knife at the table, the scrape of stone filling the stillness. After a while he asked, "Why do you stay?" The question surprised even him. Asha didn't answer right away. When she did look at him, her eyes were steady. "Better here," she said softly. "Better than out there." Taren nodded once, her words settling deep in him. Later after supper, he noticed her glancing toward the extra shirt and skirt he'd left on the chair. She'd been washing her first set in cold water, keeping them clean without being asked. She was beginning to claim her place. Before bed, Taren threw extra wood on the fire so it would last through the night. When he turned, Asha was already lying down, but this time she faced the room instead of the wall. Their eyes met briefly in the flickering light. "Good night," Taren said quietly. For the first time, she answered, "Good night." He lay back, staring at the low rafters, the sound of crackling fire mixed with her steady breathing. It was a small thing hearing her voice, but it stayed with him long after sleep came a quiet sign that she'd begun to trust him, even if just a little. The next morning felt different. The cabin seemed warmer not just from the fire, but from the quiet presence of someone who finally belonged there. When Taren came in from checking the barn, Asha had already swept the floor and was boiling water on the stove. She didn't look up when he entered, but set 2 tin cups of coffee on the table, one in front of his chair. He stood for a moment, taking in the simple sight. She'd done it on her own, not because he told her, but because she wanted to. "Thank you," he said, and meant it. She glanced up, offered a brief look, then went back to her work. From then on, their days fell into rhythm. Taren repaired a fence rail while Asha patched the sleeves of his old coat with careful stitches. At noon, they shared meals together instead of opposite corners. She no longer ate like she feared the food might be taken away. When Taren rode out to check the far pasture, he still wondered if she might vanish while he was gone. But every time he returned, she was there waiting by the hearth, mending gloves or stirring the fire. The sight of her there loosened something tight in his chest. That night, as the wind howled against the cabin and rattled a loose shutter, Taren added more wood to the fire. Asha pulled her blanket closer, the firelight dancing across her face. He hesitated before lying down, realizing that the cabin no longer felt like a place of silence and ghosts. It was beginning to feel like home again. Taren Wolfmark sat quietly at the table, the fire throwing restless shadows that danced along the rough-hewn walls. After a long while, his voice broke the stillness. "Do you ever miss your people, Asha?" Moonleaf looked up, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then she said softly, "Yes." A brief silence passed before she added, "But I'm still alive." Taren nodded slowly. He knew that feeling too well, what it meant to be left standing when everyone else was gone. Sometimes survival itself was the only victory a soul could claim. Their words faded, but something subtle shifted between them. The silence that followed wasn't cold, it was shared. When Taren finally lay back on his bed, he glanced toward the hearth. Asha sat watching the flames, her hair spilling over one shoulder, the firelight tracing the shape of her cheek. She looked calm, at peace, in a way that stirred something deep in him. For the first time since the war, Taren felt the cabin wasn't just shelter, it was becoming a home. The days that followed carried a rhythm that reminded him of the world before the gunfire. Not joy exactly, but steadiness. Each morning he woke to the soft scrape of Asha moving about the cabin, sometimes already outside, gathering wood or hauling water. She didn't wait for permission anymore. She worked as if the place belonged to her, too. Taren found that he liked it. He liked coming back to a clean floor, a hot stove, and the quiet presence of someone who made the house feel less hollow. But with that comfort came a new weight, an ache he hadn't felt in years. It wasn't the empty loneliness he'd carried for so long. It was sharper, heavier. He noticed things he shouldn't, the way Asha's hair slid down her back when she bent to stir the fire, the soft sway of her hips when she crossed the room. More than once, he caught himself watching too long, then looking away, his jaw set tight. On the third night, the wind howled so hard it shook the cabin walls. Taren sat at the table mending a bridle strap when a loud bang startled Asha. "Just the shutter," he said, rising. "I'll fix it." She followed him to the door. "No," she said quickly, her tone trembling just enough to make him pause. He turned to her. "You afraid I won't come back?" She hesitated, then nodded once. His chest tightened. "All right," he said quietly. "Stay back. I'll be quick." He stepped out into the freezing wind, his hands stiff as he fought the latch. Snow bit at his coat and hat, but within minutes the shutter was secure. When he came back inside, the warmth hit him hard, and Asha was still there. Arms folded, eyes locked on him. "See," he said, pulling off his gloves. "Still here." She stepped aside so he could pass, then shut the door behind him. Later after supper, Taren sat near the fire instead of the table. Asha sat on the floor by the hearth, her blanket wrapped around her shoulders. The flames painted the room in gold, their shadows flickering like breath against the walls. For a long time, neither spoke. Then her quiet voice broke the silence. "Why do you stay here?" Taren stared into the fire. It wasn't a question he'd ever asked himself aloud. "Because it's mine," he said finally. "Because no one can take it from me. Not anymore." She nodded slowly, as if she understood more than his words. The silence returned, but this time it was heavy with something waiting to be said. Asha shifted closer to the fire, and her knee brushed against his leg. She froze, ready to pull away, but Taren didn't move. His pulse hammered in his chest, that small touch louder than the storm outside. "You can sit up here," he said at last, gesturing to the bench beside him. Asha hesitated, then rose. The blanket slipped from her shoulders as she crossed the room. She sat near him close enough that he could smell the faint scent of soap on her skin. The fire popped, sending sparks upward. Taren turned to look at her. The orange glow traced her profile, her calm breathing, the soft strength in her face. Without thinking, he reached out, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered against her cheek. She didn't flinch. Asha turned her head slightly and met his gaze. Her eyes weren't fearful anymore, they were searching, steady. "You trust me now?" he asked quietly. She held his gaze for a heartbeat, then nodded. It was all the answer he needed. Taren leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. She didn't. Their first kiss was gentle and uncertain, his hand cupping her cheek, hers resting on his arm. When they drew apart, she didn't retreat, just sat there breathing softly, eyes on his. Taren stood after a moment, his voice rough. "Fire needs more wood," he murmured, turning toward the hearth. But the truth was, it wasn't the fire that needed warmth anymore. Taren Wolfmark's voice came out rough as gravel as he reached for another log. Asha Moonleaf stood too, helping him place it on the glowing coals before stepping back. She drew the blanket tighter around her shoulders and settled down near the hearth again, only this time her face turned toward him instead of the fire. Taren sat on the edge of his bed, pulled off his boots, and lay back, staring up at the rafters. His heart was still hammering, but it didn't feel wrong. It felt restored, like something that had quietly fallen back into place after being broken too long. As sleep began to take him, he could hear her slow, even breathing, and the faint hiss of snow melting off the roof. The storm outside had passed, but the air in the cabin was warm now, alive in a way he hadn't felt in years. When Taren woke before dawn, the cabin was dim but still glowing with leftover warmth. He lay there for a moment, staring up at the shadows on the ceiling, the memory of last night replaying in his mind the feel of Asha's hair beneath his fingertips, the quiet weight of her gaze, the softness of her lips. He hadn't touched anyone that way since before the war, not since Suni Wildrose had died. It felt strange and right all at once, like remembering a part of himself he thought was gone forever. He sat up, pulling on his boots, and glanced toward the hearth. Asha was curled under her blanket, awake. Her eyes met his, calm and steady. There was no fear in them, no shame, only quiet understanding. "Morning," Taren said as he laced his boots. "Morning," she replied softly, brushing the blanket aside and sitting up, her dark hair falling loose over one shoulder. They ate breakfast in silence, but it wasn't the kind that hurt. It was full-weighted with something unspoken. Asha moved through the cabin as if she'd always belonged there, setting out plates, pouring coffee, knowing where everything went without needing to ask. Taren caught himself watching her once or twice, then forced his eyes back to his food. Afterward, they bundled up and stepped into the cold. Snow had drifted through the night, piling against the fences and half burying the corral rails. He showed her how to check the herd for frostbite, how to break the ice on the water troughs, and clear it before filling them again. Her cheeks were bright from the wind, her breath puffing white, but she never complained. When one calf bolted from the pen, she moved fast to head it off, sure-footed and quick. "You've done this before," Taren said, leaning on the fence. Asha shrugged. "Some work's the same everywhere," she said simply. He smiled faintly. "Fair enough." By noon, the sky had turned a clear, cold blue. They rode back to the cabin for coffee, snow crunching under their boots. Asha brushed frost from her skirt before stepping inside, went straight to the stove, and stirred the pot of beans she'd left simmering. Taren stood for a moment in the doorway, watching her move. She worked with quiet purpose now, like the cabin had finally accepted her, like they both belonged. But the rhythm of the day broke when he heard distant hoofbeats. A rider was cutting across the ridge. Taren stepped outside, pulling his coat tight against the wind. It was Vance Hollowbrook, a neighboring rancher. Evening. Taren Vance called, reining in his horse. "Heard you've got company up here." Taren's jaw tightened. "Maybe I do." "Town's been talking," Vance said, his tone cautious. "Some folks don't like it. Say you've got a thief holed up here, a girl from the reservation." "That's enough," Taren said quietly, but his voice carried the weight that ended a conversation. Vance lifted his brows, nodded once. "Just thought you ought to know." He turned his horse and rode off, the sound of hooves fading into the cold. Taren stood there for a long minute, watching the empty trail. He knew what was coming. Talk spread fast in these parts, rumor faster still. When he stepped back inside, Asha was by the table, her eyes full of unspoken worry. "Man from town," Taren said, hanging up his coat. "They know you're here." She froze, as if bracing for the words that would send her away. "You're not leaving," Taren said firmly. Something in her shoulders eased. She nodded once, then quietly turned back to the stove. That night the cabin was hushed again, but not the same. The air between them felt charged alive with something neither of them could name. Taren sat on the bench near the fire. Asha sat across from him, mending a pair of worn socks she'd found in a chest. The soft scratch of the needle and the pop of the fire filled the silence. Sometimes their eyes met, and neither looked away too quickly. When she finished, she folded the socks, neatly set them aside, then moved a little closer to the fire. Taren could feel her warmth from across the small room. "You sure?" Asha asked quietly after a long pause. He looked up. "Sure of what keeping me here?" Taren leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. "I don't let other folks tell me how to run my place," he said. "You work hard. You've earned your keep. And," he hesitated, his voice roughening, "I want you here." Asha studied him a moment, her face unreadable, then gave a single slow nod. It was enough. Later, when Taren banked the fire and blew out the lamp, Asha lay down near the hearth. But this time she didn't turn her back to the room. She faced him, eyes open, until darkness filled the cabin. Taren Wolfmark lay on his side, watching the faint glow of the embers fade into deep orange, listening to the stillness settle around the cabin. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the crushing weight of loneliness pressing on his chest. By morning, when he saddled his horse to ride into town for supplies, Asha Moonleaf stood by the porch steps, arms crossed against the chill. "You're going?" she asked softly, her tone uncertain, testing whether he'd trust her alone. Taren nodded. "I'll be back before sundown." She hesitated, then said quietly, "I will wait." Those 3 words stayed with him all the way to town and back, echoing in his mind louder than the creak of the saddle or the wind across the plains. When he returned that evening, the sight of smoke curling from the chimney eased something deep inside him. The cabin was just as he'd left it, the fire strong, the smell of stew thick in the air, and Asha inside waiting. He shut the door behind him and felt a quiet peace settle over him like a blanket. She'd kept her word. She'd waited. 2 days later, he heard the sound of hooves again, but this time it wasn't just one rider. 3 men came up the trail, their horses snorting clouds of steam into the cold air. Taren stepped onto the porch before they reached the gate. Asha stayed inside, but he could sense her standing just behind the door. The man in front, Cole Maddox, the town deputy, reined in his horse. "Wolfmark," he said flatly. "We've had complaints. Folks are saying you've got a woman here who doesn't belong." Taren folded his arms across his chest. "She's here. She's safe. That's all anyone needs to know." One of the ranchers, Dane Quickfall, spat into the dirt. "Safe. She's Apache, ain't she?" "Could be. She was part of those raids last spring." Taren's jaw flexed. His voice stayed calm but cold. "She works this land same as I do. She's earned her keep. She's a thief." The other rancher, Roarin' Pike, snapped. "Town's got a right to deal with that." Taren stepped down from the porch boots, crunching over frost. She stole corn to stay alive. That debt was paid the moment she stepped foot here. He squared his shoulders. "If you've got a problem with that, you take it up with me." Cole Maddox glanced between them, his breath visible in the cold air. "This'll stir trouble, Taren." "Let it," Taren said evenly. "She stays." The deputy studied him for a long moment, then gave a curt nod. "All right." He turned his horse and started down the trail, the 2 ranchers muttering as they followed. When the sound of hooves faded, Taren turned back toward the cabin. Asha stood in the doorway, her hands clenched at her sides, her face calm, defiant even. "They will come again," she asked quietly. Maybe Taren admitted stepping back onto the porch. "But I'm not handing you over." Her expression softened just slightly. Why Taren hesitated, then took a slow breath. Because you're not a problem to be rid of, he said finally. You're part of this place now. Part of my life. For the first time since she'd arrived, Asha's mouth curved into the faintest smile. Then I stay, she whispered. The words hung between them like a vow binding them in a way neither had expected. The weight of it settled in his chest, not as a burden, but as something solid and right. That night the cabin glowed with warmth. They sat closer than before, the fire crackling softly between them. Taren watched as Asha braided her long dark hair, the flames turning it the color of copper. You don't have to sleep on the floor, he said suddenly. Asha looked up, surprised. I can build another bed, he went on, voice low and uncertain. Somewhere you can. She rose before he could finish, crossing the space between them. Her hand came to rest lightly against his chest, her fingers steady and warm. I stay here, she said softly. Taren's breath caught. He reached up, brushing her hair back, his thumb tracing the edge of her cheek. Then he pulled her gently closer. Their kiss this time wasn't hesitant like the first. It was certain months of quiet tension and waiting breaking open all at once. When they parted, Asha rested her forehead against his chest, her breathing calm and sure. Taren wrapped his arms around her, feeling her fit perfectly there, as if she'd always been meant to. Neither spoke. He added another log to the fire, turned down the lamp, and the room sank into a golden hush. Asha spread her blanket near the hearth, but when he lay down on his bed, he could still see her face in the flickering light turned toward him. She wasn't afraid anymore. And for the first time in years, neither was he. By morning, the snow had stopped. Taren hitched the wagon, tightening the reins. Where are you going? Asha asked, pulling her shawl close around her shoulders. He looked back at her, the ghost of a smile tugging at his lips. To make sure no one forgets she's not alone anymore. Town Taren Wolfmark said, tightening the cinch strap on his saddle. We need supplies, and maybe it's time they see you with me. Asha Moonleaf's brow creased, but after a moment she nodded. The ride into town was quiet. The road was still half-frozen wagon wheels, squeaking horses breathing white clouds into the air. Asha sat beside him, her hands folded neatly in her lap, eyes scanning the horizon. Taren could sense the tension in her shoulders, but she didn't ask to turn back. When they reached Main Street, the townsfolk stopped what they were doing. Heads turned, conversations went quiet. Taren climbed down first, then turned and offered his hand. Asha hesitated for just a heartbeat before taking it, stepping down with her chin held high. Whispers rose around them like dust in the wind, but Taren ignored them. He walked into the general store with Asha beside him, bought flour, sugar, and nails, then laid his coins on the counter, without meeting anyone's eyes. When they stepped back outside, Vance Hollowbrook was leaning against a post across the street, watching. She stays with me, Taren said, his voice carrying down the boardwalk. The murmurs stopped. No one argued. No one dared. The line had been drawn clear enough. As they walked back to the wagon, Asha's hand brushed against his. She didn't pull away when he laced his fingers through hers. By the time they reached the ranch again, the sun had dipped low, turning the snow into sheets of gold. Taren helped her down, and stood for a moment watching as she walked toward the cabin, the soft swing of her skirt in the evening light. Something in his chest eased. The worst was over. Everyone knew now, and it didn't matter anymore. That night they ate in silence, but it was the kind of silence shared by two people who had already chosen each other. No words were needed. When Taren banked the fire and turned down the lamp, Asha didn't spread her blanket by the hearth. She stayed standing a moment longer, then crossed the room to him. You sure? She asked, her voice low and certain. I'm sure, he said, and this time when they lay down it was side by side. By late March, the snow melted into thin gray streaks along the fence line. The ground had softened enough for Taren to sink a spade into the earth without hitting frost. The air smelled different now, less of smoke and iron, more of wet soil and the promise of spring. For the first time in months, he felt winter finally lifting off his shoulders. Asha was outside early that morning, her skirts brushing the damp ground as she scattered seed along the garden rows he'd dug the day before. The sun caught her hair loose and dark, shining like onyx in the morning light. She worked with quiet focus hands, sure and steady. Taren watched from the porch, then came down to join her. "You missed a spot," he teased gently as he knelt beside her. She glanced at him, the corner of her mouth curving. "Then you fix it." He did pressing seed into the soil with his rough, scarred fingers. The earth was cool alive. Working side by side felt natural. Now, no need for orders, no need for words. They moved in rhythm, each instinctively knowing the other's pace. When they finished, they stood together looking at the dark lines of turned soil. "Good," Asha said simply. "Good," Taren agreed, brushing dirt from his palms. Inside over coffee, he noticed how much the cabin had changed. It no longer felt like a hollow refuge. Every inch bore her touch, the mended curtains, the stitched chairs, the neatly folded quilt at the foot of the bed. The space was warm, lived-in whole. It wasn't just a place he slept anymore. It was home. The men who once rode up to challenge him hadn't returned. Cole Maddox had passed by on patrol one afternoon, tipped his hat, and said nothing. Taren figured the word had spread through town he wasn't giving Asha up, and there was no sense trying. One bright afternoon, Taren took the wagon into town for lumber. Asha went with him, sitting close on the bench, her hair tied back against the wind. People still looked their way, but the stares didn't last. Edna Miles at the store even spoke to Asha, offering her a bolt of fabric at a fair price. Asha accepted it with a small nod, and Taren felt something loosen deep inside him. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were being seen. When they got home, Asha washed the dust from her face and changed into the clean cotton shirt he'd bought her. Taren was on the porch, sharpening his axe, when she stepped out and stood before him. He looked up. "What is it?" Asha didn't answer at first. She took his hand, guided it gently to her stomach, and pressed it there. For a moment, he didn't understand. Then it hit him. "You're sure?" he asked, voice barely a whisper. She nodded once, eyes calm and certain. "Yes." Taren went still, his calloused hand resting over hers. A strange mix of awe and fear rose in his chest, then joy, sharp and real. He hadn't dared to dream of this again, not after losing Suni Wildrose and Tika Snowbud. But now, standing there in the warm light with Asha's hand over his, he could see it all clearly, a cradle near the bed, laughter echoing through the cabin's small feet on the porch, a life that carried both their names. He rose to his feet, pulled her close, and held her for a long, silent moment. This time the quiet between them wasn't the kind born of loneliness. It was the sound of a new beginning.